still go any way. And but I think in the end, I expect him probably back in Kansas City, and I don't think that's a good thing for the league or for the Chiefs or a good look. But as you said, it's easier said than done to cut a player of his magnitude, and there is a double standard, unfortunately, sometimes in sports where the superstars are cut some slack, and the Odell Beckhams of the world and the Antonio Browns, and not that they've been involved with domestic violence, but they've been involved with plenty of shenanigans off the field. And as we saw with Beckham in the hotel in Paris, with what looked like some drug paraphernalia, shall we say, but we're not accusing him of anything, of course. And so it's a kind of a crazy situation out there that happens sometimes. But yeah, the Hill situation. Personally, if I'm in Kansas City and I'm the owner, I'm the GM, I'd rather find someone else to take his spot. And as I said, they did draft a burner wide receiver, and if that guy can show up in training camp and do really well and play well this season, I'd be trying to move on from Tyreek Hill, because I think something else is going to happen with that guy. I just think he's a bad guy.
Yeah, I agree with you, absolutely. Let's go to another receiver, Julio Jones. Other than maybe the occasional contract dispute, Julio Jones is basically the stand-up role model type wide receiver. He's always in incredible shape. He plays hard. He plays hurt. He never causes problems off the field, unless it's just him trying to get a better deal for himself. What's the deal with his contract coming up?
Yeah, I did write about Julio for my sportingnews.com column this week, which will be out this afternoon. And I think he's in an interesting situation. When he got his extension done in 2015, he was the highest paid wide receiver in the league, quickly surpassed by first Antonio Brown. Julio's deal was around a little over $14 million a year. Then Antonio Brown signs a couple years later about 2 years later for $17 million a year. Then Beckham gets $18 million a year that can go to 19 with incentives. And now you've got Michael Thomas out there who's talking that he wants to get to 20 to 22 million a year on his new deal, and that he would be up for an extension next year. And so there's a lot of kind of things going on in the wide receiver marketplace right now. And even Antonio Brown, when he got traded to the Raiders, got an additional $11 million kicked into his contract, I guess, so he'd accept the move to Oakland, as if what was his choice at that point when he had already talked his way out of Pittsburgh. And so I think Julio, the owner, Arthur Blank, has said it's going to get done. So has Thomas Dimitroff. They did kind of a restructure of his deal last year. They moved $2.9 million from this year's base salary into last year to appease him and avoid a training camp holdout. And now we're on the verge of training camp. And again, he's still got 2 years left on his deal. But I think they told him at the time, we don't want to negotiate a deal with more than 2 years left. And once you get to 2 years, then we're going to get it done. So I expect the Falcons to get him signed in that over $20 million a year range in new money, and with a significant guarantee in the $50 million range or whatever. And I think the risky part of it for the Falcons is that he is 30 years old, but so is Antonio Brown. And if you have confidence in a player and you trust his work ethic, which the Falcons, I'm sure, do, and the production has been there, and he's been able to, as you said, overcome injuries. He's only missed 3 games in the last 5 years. I made the analogy, it's kind of similar to when I did an extension with Chris Carter in 1998. Chris was 32 years old at the time, and I made him equal to the highest paid receivers in the league because I knew what kind of work ethic he had. I knew how he kept in shape, and I thought that he could play at that level for several more years, which he did, and was a Pro Bowler for many more years under that 5-year deal that we did the extension in 1998. And he was such an integral part of our offense, which was a record-setting offense, And I think Julio Jones kind of falls into that category of a guy that should get paid and will get paid.
Let's wrap up the show with some of your personal observations, because Chris Carter was a great player. He deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, and he was always kept himself in impeccable shape. He was, as tough a receiver as we've seen. He maybe had the best hands I've ever seen, but he did have his early career problems. He straightened himself out once he got to Minnesota, and even though he was a model athlete in many ways with the Vikings, he also sometimes drove his teammates crazy because he was a tough guy to be around sometimes. Then he had Randy Moss, one of the greatest receivers of all time, who was spectacular when he was with the Vikings, and he had all these weird little incidents where he kind of showed some defiance. He walked off the field on his team once. But he wasn't like he was out there getting arrested for domestic violence. I'm just wondering, on a daily basis, were Randy Moss and Chris Carter difficult to have around, or was that more just, I'll just end the question there. Were they difficult to be around on a daily basis?
Not for me at the time as a GM in Minnesota, and I had a really good relationship with both those guys, and I think Randy definitely came into the league with a chip on his shoulder. And by then, Chris was obviously well established as a Pro Bowl receiver, and it was interesting. I think the leadership part of Chris's game. I think some of the players really did look to him as a leader. I think some didn't because of kind of that personality that he had, but I think he certainly embraced the role of being a mentor for Randy Moss in his rookie season, particularly when that was my last year in Minnesota when we drafted Randy in the first round, and he had the spectacular season, and I think Chris had a significant role in that. So no, these guys were not difficult for me to be around. In fact, Chris Carter I was very close to, and he was one of the players, and I always kind of did this as a GM and as a team president, that I always had a player or two that I would go to and go have lunch if we were on the road in a preseason game or something like that. In Tennessee, it was Eddie George. In Minnesota, Chris Carter, I was very close to. I would talk to him, and it kind of helped me get a feel for the pulse of the team and what they're thinking about and what they think they're missing. Maybe it's a team breakfast in the facility, and instead of having guys go to McDonald's and getting their breakfast McNuggets or what they're getting, and so I think it was a good situation for me with Chris, and we've stayed close to this day. I was at his Hall of Fame induction a couple of years back, and just as I've stayed close with a lot of players over the years, and saw a bunch of those guys very recently, as recently as a couple of weeks ago, at a celebration tribute for John Michaels, the former Vikings offensive line coach, that was out at the Vikings Museum at the TCO Performance Center, and saw a lot of those former players, which is kind of fun to see those guys when you haven't seen them for a long time, and kind of amazing, Jim, when you see a guy like Gary Zimmerman, and hard to recognize some of these guys because they're so much thinner than they were when they played. They've lost so much weight over time, but it was nice to be able to visit with Zim and see guys like Randall McDaniel, and there was a center back in the Tommy Kramer, Scott Studwell era, back in the late 70s, early 80s. Dennis Swilley was our starting center. I could not even recognize Dennis Swilley. Had a nice talk with him. Bob Hagan, the Vikings PR mogul, had to kind of tell me, hey, that's Dennis Swilley. I said, you're kidding.
Wow.
It did not look like him at all compared to what I remember Dennis Swilley like. And so, but it was a fun experience to see those guys. And as I said, but in Chris Carter's situation, I was very close to Chris at the time. Randy, not quite as close to, but I've talked to him many times over the years. I saw him when I was with the Titans. We played the Vikings, had a nice visit with him then. And also, I had a pretty close relationship with his agent, Bus Cook, and I think that helped keep the connection with Randy and with Joel Siegel, his agent, later in his career. And so I talked to Randy after he was selected at the Hall of Fame, had a nice conversation with him to congratulate him, and so we've always kept a good relationship too. So no, to me, those guys were not difficult, but I could see for other people from time to time they could be, and they both had their ins and outs with the media, so to speak, as you well know.
Yeah, well, I mean, Chris was always really good with me. Randy was always difficult with everybody. But, I don't want to define these guys just through the media lens. What's really important is how they are in the building, how they conduct themselves in public, how they treat people, And, Randy was a little up and down there. Chris, just because Chris could tick people off with that look and that tone.
Yes.
But still, I mean, they're still both deserving Hall of Famers, no matter how you look at it. Hey, next week, let's talk about the Dak Prescott negotiations and just how the quarterback landscape has changed since Kirk Cousins signed his deal, which kind of opened a couple of doors, and maybe talk about Laquan Treadwell's future. For now, let's thank whitebearlakesuperstore.com, and if you have a final thought for us, Jeff, hit me up with it.
Well, I think that final thought would just be that as we said, it's the dead period in the NFL, but it's not so dead, and there's still lots of stuff going on, and especially for team front office people and marketing people, that they're getting ready for training camp. They're getting ready to host training camp at TCO Performance Center, getting all the ticketing situations figured out, how many fans are going to be let in each day, and it's a lot different than what it used to be, getting ready to go to Mankato. And I talked to Dennis Ryan, the Vikings, a longtime equipment manager, out at the John Michaels Tribute, and we were talking about it's certainly a lot easier for guys like Dennis not to be packing up tons and tons of football gear and weight equipment and all kinds of trucks going down to Mankato. They can stay put at their home in Eagan, and that's definitely, I think, a plus for a team.
Absolutely. All right, great stuff from Jeff. Enjoy your daughter's wedding this weekend, and I say that with all sincerity. Enjoy every minute of it. As you know, these things don't come along very often, and congratulations, and thanks to everybody who listens to the show and the program, and we'll be back next week because there's always something happening in the NFL.